You're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Give me a full ballerina skirt and a hint of saloon, and I'm on board.
I have a hole in my stomach!
I can't go back.
Welcome to the She Became Visible podcast. I'm your host, Renee Steelman. This podcast is my story. It's your story. It's our story. It's all the stories of all the women who one day knew that it was time to remember who they were, who they are, and stand up and be seen. Hello, welcome to She Became Visible. I'm Renee Steelman, your host, and I have an amazing guest on my show today. I have Anna LeBaron. Now, if you are not familiar with the LeBaron saga, then I have just given you a gift of what you can binge watch for the next couple of days. Because on Hulu, there is a documentary about Anna and her family. Now, there's a couple of videos or documentaries on Netflix that encompass the LeBaron family. One of them is, I'll ask Anna, the Murders Amongst the Mormons. That was the Lafferty. Right? No, Banner of Heaven was the Lafferty, and Murder Amongst the Mormons was an extension of the Mexican. Anyway, I'll have Anna. Anyway, there's a whole thing on the polygamous families on Netflix, and Anna is the star of the one about her father, Avril LeBaron. I think she'll correct me. But this man was absolutely amazing, unless you were raised in the Mormon culture. And if you were raised in the Mormon culture, you will go, oh, that sounds right. Yeah, that pretty much is historical. I get that. And it's absolutely amazing. But we're going to talk about that. But the most important thing is we're going to talk about Anna today, because in the Netflix documentary, it primarily is about her father, the murders, the capture, the hunt, everything that went down about capturing her father and the murders that he committed. And her multiple siblings are obviously a part of it. But I want to talk about what Anna has done with her life, in spite of the traumatic childhood that she had, because it's such an example for all of us. And I think it's motivating for all of us to see where she's come and what she came from. So let me bring Anna on stage. Hello.
Hello, Renee. How are you? I'm so glad to be here today.
I am so thrilled. And again, pronounce your father's name, Avril?
It's Ervil.
Ervil. Okay,
Yes.
Ervil. E-R-V-A-L.
V-I-L.
V-I-L. Ervil. Okay.
Ervil.
Okay. Very similar to evil.
Yes, like evil, but with an R.
Yeah. There you
And
go.
then just another thing is the documentary Daughters of the Cult is streaming on Hulu and on Disney Plus.
Okay, that's right. And the other, actually,
And the other one having to do with the LeBaron family, but not associated with like specifically Ervil. I've not watched it yet. The Massacre Among the Mormons, I believe it's called. Yeah, I can't remember exactly. And I haven't had the opportunity to watch it yet, so I can't speak to that one. But
yeah.
I did watch Under the Banner of Heaven, which you mentioned. And that one is also streaming on Hulu. And it's about the Lafferty brothers, as you said. And it's based on the book by the same title, Under the Banner of Heaven. And not in the doc drama series by that title, but in the book, there's a whole chapter about the LeBaron family in the book by John Krakauer.
Okay, thank you. You're absolutely right. And I think that is also on Hulu, if I remember correctly, when I was searching documentaries. And I had watched Anna's documentary last year, I think. Absolutely blown away. And but not really knowing her personally, not knowing you personally, I looked at how strong all of you girls were, and even your brother Hiram. How's he doing?
He's doing well. We just adore him so much.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny because there's such. I mean, I have a friend whose daughter, has a grandson, Hiram, active Mormon, active LDS, active in the Brighamite Mormon.
Well,
fragment.
Hiram is a very Mormon name. So
Yeah. Nephi's and the Mormons and the Samayas and there. That's why you cannot escape. You cannot separate these fragments of the Joseph Smith religion because they all come from the same soup, and the beliefs are the same. Really, polygamy was the deciding separation. But other than that, everything they teach is exactly the same, including blood atonement.
Well, the blood atonement is no longer taught by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I make a distinction between the modern day Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has worked very hard to make themselves more socially acceptable as time has gone on.
Absolutely.
So, and there's a distinction between fundamentalist Mormons who continue the practice of polygamy mainly. Now, there are people who practice blood atonements and they call it different things. My father called it blood atonement. But there are other fundamentalists and very extreme fundamentalists who are doing that still. And one of them recently was Chad and Lori Daybell, who are both tried and convicted of murder. And they called it something different, but the effect of it was the same.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up because you're so right. And they, like you said, they were carrying out kind of a pseudo polygamy. Like they knew that it was illegal. She was married.
It was absolutely polygamy. Absolutely. They were both married to their own spouses at the time that they went into a temple, and supposedly Jesus Christ and the angel Moroni were with them and sanctioned them getting married or sealed for time and all eternity in this polygamist arrangement where, and it's not just polygamous, but also if Lori already had a husband and now has another one, that's, I think, called polyandry.
Yeah.
And that's something that my mother also was guilty of. She was married to a husband and then got sealed to my father for time and all eternity.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what Joseph Smith was doing to the women that he was marrying. Some of the women he married already had husbands, and then they were sealed to Joseph Smith.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Even though people want to say that that's all in the past and it's dead and gone, it's really not. And Chad and Lori Daybell are the most recent example. And they were similar to my father in that he was carrying out blood atonements. And again, Chad and Lori were calling it something else, but the effect was the same. People ended up dead.
Yeah.
That they decided had to be, taken out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I love how you brought up the fact that the age of information, the way we have social media, the internet, you can't hide things the way that all of these cults used to hide things.
Correct.
And
they used to be able to keep people subjugated because they lacked information, they lacked resources, they lacked any kind of outsider help. And people were so afraid of practicing polygamists that, they weren't kind to people who were getting out of this. But now there's resources available. There are groups and communities of people who help those who are coming out of polygamy and want help to make that transition. And so because of the age of information, people within these groups are finding it easier to access the help that's available to them to get out and to reestablish their lives on the outside of the cults that are in existence still.
That's so true. So for better or for worse, the social media is helping people in one way or another.
Yeah.
And
the title of your show, She Became Visible. Like these women are finding ways to become visible where They before the information age, they were basically invisible in our societies. We were practicing polygamists right under the noses of people around us, very invisibly.
Yeah.
And guess what? I'm not invisible anymore.
Exactly. Thank you. That's a perfect segue. I love that because this is why I love your story so much. So let's start out because you've already mentioned this, how your mother ended up marrying Ervil and then where you were at in the line of siblings.
Mhm.
And let's start from the very beginning, how this all started.
Well, my family of origin on my father's side goes back 4 generations to a man named Benjamin F. Johnson, who was the spiritually adopted son of Joseph Smith. He was his right-hand man and kind of like a scribe. He was his very close associate of Joseph Smith, who eventually spiritually adopted him in the same way that women are spiritually married to another man. You know, it involves ceremonies and special ordinances and all these things. So that was Benjamin F. Johnson. And so on my father's side, I'm a first generation monogamist. My mother was raised LDS. She and her husband at the time had 5 children. They lived in Arizona, heard my father speak, and were converted to his fundamentalist religion. And then my mother immediately fell madly in love with Ervil, who was the itinerant preacher that came to town. And Ervil had a revelation that my mother was supposed to be his wife instead of the husband that she already had. So they were sealed for time and all eternity in these secret little marriages that the polygamists do. And my mother became Ervil LeBaron's spiritual wife, or, you know, she became his 4th wife. And my mother had 5 children that she brought into that marriage, and then had 7 children with my father. And I was my mother's 10th child. And my father eventually had 13 wives and fathered 51 children himself. And I'm somewhere in the middle of that lineup. I've never done all of the math to figure out where I am in that lineup, but based on my best guesses, it's somewhere in the middle. And like I said in the documentary, polygamist math is hard.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to kind of get all the numbers straight so you can figure these kinds of things out.
Well, and I think what's interesting is I know that your first cousin is Christine Brown, who was married to Cody on the Sister Wives TV show.
Correct.
And that's a perfect example of what your mother did. Legally, he's married to one person, but
Correct.
spiritually, he has all of these other wives. And that's what, you know, Joseph Smith did the same thing. It's like, you know, he was married to Emma, but he had all of these other spiritual wives because it was illegal, people. Yes. I know a lot of people will argue, well, it was a different time. It's like, no, it was illegal then
It's
too.
still illegal today. So
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's why there's only one legal wife ever. And so
but I find it interesting. And this is, I think, what I'm going towards is because of your mother's background with Joseph Smith and a belief that he was a prophet. And I don't know how much historical information she had, but this man was repeating what Joseph Smith did. And
well,
said.
My father was actually teaching the original teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the original sacred texts of the modern day Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you know, including the Book of Mormon, the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, the Journal of Discourses, the Pearl of Great Price. There's all of these sacred texts of the church that my father knew and taught. And he was able to convert people that were part of the modern day church into his fundamentalist religion because the modern day church was no longer teaching and practicing what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and the early prophets were teaching.
Right. Right. And I think that, you know, they say, if you don't know your history, it will repeat itself. And it's amazing, even in this day and age, that people, they look at these fragments. I think I heard that there were over 400, sections of Mormonism,
Right.
other groups that broke off, over 400, and they all go back to some kind of a teaching that they don't think is being taught nowadays.
Correct.
And so but they're still following the same outline that was given by Joseph Smith. They just have a new power hungry leader that's taken over. And the fact that they can convince intelligent, wonderful, kind, loving people to believe that blows your mind. But it's so frequent that you just start going, oh yeah, I get it.
It's my concern for, in this modern age isn't people that are part of the, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My concern isn't for the ones who are just like going along to get along as part of that religion. My concern is for the faithful, true, believing members of that church who believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet.
Yeah.
Who actually believe that, because they're the ones who are susceptible to the early teachings. They're the ones like Chad and Lori Daybells and all the people who were surrounding them, because just because Chad and Lori went to prison and convicted and sentenced to life in prison doesn't mean the others that surrounded them don't still believe those things. It took a while before my father's church, if you want to call it, finally disbanded. It took a good 10 years after he was dead and gone. He died in prison. 10 years after is when it finally disbanded and completely, I say, burned itself to the ground, just for a lack of a better term.
Yeah, you're so right. Because I don't know, Anna, if you're following, but there's been this absolute rush of temple building by Russell Nelson, the current prophet. And I know that I don't know. My own opinion is that he has an ego larger than this world. And he is going to be 100 next month. And he wants his legacy to be, I did more than anybody. So he's got this push to build temples. And right now there's a big thing going on in Fairview where they want to build a huge, huge temple, 173 feet high. And the city ordinances are saying, no, we would love for you to build your temple, but these are the rules that we have, the city ordinances, to build a building in this area of town. Please comply. Mm-hmm. And they just had another city council meeting, and they said they voted 7-0 to not approve the plans to build this temple. And the church the next day was like, well, we'll see you in court.
Oh, well, I can't speak to that. That's not my area of expertise.
What you said, though, was the most frightening part. Was letters went out to members of the church. Bishops, stake presidents sent out letters to the members saying, please write letters to this city council. Please show up and wear a blue shirt, and please stand up at the microphone and tell them why your church has to have a 173-foot steeple. And they did it. And that's the scary one. The ones who followed the rules blindly and obediently. Those are the scary ones. You're absolutely right. I love that you made that connection. So you were 3 years old. So you don't have a lot of memories before around 3. But
I don't have a lot of memories, during that time period, because we moved around so much. But when I was about 9 months old is when my mom left the LeBaron colony where I was born in Mexico. And then that was right around the time that Joel LeBaron and my father split. They had founded a church and had a falling out. And my father became like power hungry and, had an ego and had mental health challenges, which were never diagnosed because people with mental health generally think there's nothing wrong with them, yes, especially the types of things that he evidenced in his life. And so he never diagnosed, but just such mental health challenges mixed with this very toxic and very deadly religion and doctrine of blood atonement, which created just an enormous, he became bloodthirsty and ordered the killing of his brother. And one of his followers carried it out. It was Dan Jordan who did that one. And I was 3 years old when the first murder that my father ordered, or blood atonement, was carried out.
On his own brother, who was very charismatic and very loving and had quite a following.
Yes.
And he was not, for some reason, that power and money thing didn't affect him, but Ervil went out and bought a Cadillac or a fancy car.
Yeah.
You know, it was just so indicative of what's happening now. You know, the LDS Church now is the largest private landowner in the United States.
Wow.
They're buying up property like crazy. And it's just, there's such a symbiotic thing going on there. So he has his own brother killed. You're 3, and you have to move. You have to leave.
I mean, we moved around my entire childhood. We were constantly on the run from the law. Eventually, there were about 28 to 38 confirmed deaths that my father was responsible for. My father and Dan Jordan, who were the masterminds behind all of it. And this was during the 70s and 80s that these were being carried out. And it was the early 90s when it finally burned itself to the ground, as I said, and everyone got out. There are none of Ervil's children alive today because not everybody made it out alive. My dad had his own children murdered when it became necessary to him.
Wow.
So not everybody made it out alive. And we have some siblings who were part of the carrying out of the blood atonements who are still serving sentences in prison. And but the ones that are out that survived and are not incarcerated, each one of us has picked up the pieces of our lives and have carried on. And there's not anyone anymore who believed that Ervil LeBaron was a prophet. And that's something that I can be so grateful for every day. I don't have to worry about being blood atoned at all, which if that was even a risk, I couldn't have written the book or, been public with my story.
Right. And you know what? That is, let me just quickly, I want to show the cover of your book. This might, all right, I'm going to put us in the background here. It's
end of 2016, and it was published March of 2017.
Okay. And this is your personal story. And I love when you were talking about writing this, how you brought on Leslie, because Leslie is an expert in this field. And I love, tell the audience about how she directed you, how you started out, and then she directed you on how to make your story more telling and more exciting for the listeners of the reader.
We collaborated, and that's why her name is on the front cover of the book with mine, is because I did not have the skill of writing scene or dialogue and doing those kinds of writing. That's absolutely a skill that's needed when you're going to tell a story like mine in a memoir style book. So I said I wrote the bones of the story, and I say she put the flesh and blood on it and made it come to life. So I would write what happened, and there's a difference in the writing world between telling and showing. So I could tell the story, but Leslie helped me show the story in the narrative and in the writing the scene and the dialogue and all of those things that helped make the book come to life. And so we collaborated on that. I would write and tell the story. Then she would call me, we would get on the phone together, and then she would ask me a lot of questions, and she would evoke from me the tone and the words and the dialogue and how I was feeling, what I was thinking. And then she would take what I had written and insert everything that we had talked about on the phone. And then she would send me those chapters one at a time. And my sister Celia and I would edit every single one line by line.
Oh, that's great.
To make sure that it matched the experiences that we had. And so it was a very much collaborative effort.
That's beautiful. So take us kind of from the beginning, even in the beginning of your book. Obviously, as you mentioned, I think it even mentioned it in the documentary. There were homes in Denver, in Houston, in Mexico, California. And so was there ever a time in your life where you were put into a public school and you were there long enough to make friends, establish some kind of a community, anything like that?
That would have been the stuff that dreams were made of,
Yeah.
because we were not allowed to make friends. The children would be put in public school because it was like a free form of childcare, because all the adults were having to work.
Yes.
But as soon as you were old enough to be put to work, around third, fourth, fifth grade, sometimes you would be taken out of school in order to become child slave labor in the used appliance businesses that were operated, like you said, all over the Southwest United States, California, Arizona, Mexico included, Colorado, Texas, several different cities in Texas. So we were all put to work as soon as we were old enough to do that.
So was there never anyone that would come into the appliance store and say, why aren't these children in school, and report you to the school district?
I mean, it was a different age. It was in the 70s that I was a part of that. School districts weren't keeping track of, who's enrolled and who didn't and who moved. And when you moved, it wasn't like my mom was sending our records off to the previous school, and none of that was happening. They were trying to stay off the grid as much as possible. So,
and that's exactly, even today, this little boy that was killed recently in the news, and how they just, and you experienced the same thing where you had 22 children and 3 wives in one home.
There were times, and again, it varied.
Hiding.
People came and went in the middle of the night all the time. And so when you went to sleep at night and when you woke up in the morning, the arrangement of who was in the home had changed or shifted overnight. So it was constant.
People laying next to you in sleeping bags, you'd wake up and it'd be 3 different people.
We wished there were sleeping bags. It was just old tattered blankets piled in a corner, and all the 25 kids or however many were there would just grab a blanket and cuddle up somewhere on the dirty living room floor. Like there was no such thing as like everybody had their own room. That was like ridiculous.
Yeah.
Each of the wives might have had a room, and they would keep the little babies in with them. And then all the other kids just piled up in the living room with very sparse furniture. We kept our belongings in little cardboard boxes along the side of the bedroom or the side of the living room. It wasn't anything like. Every single need that a child has was absolutely being neglected. Yeah. Emotional, psychological, medical, physical. We went hungry sometimes. Wow. We dumpster dived for food, and we were clothed with the donations that we robbed from the Goodwill boxes.
Wow.
So
and your mother, with all of these children, there wasn't any kind of, I can't do this. My kids need to see the dentist. They need to go to the doctor. They need vaccination.
No, you sacrificed all for the kingdom of God.
So everything was taken with that mindset. Mm-hmm. Everything for the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And the more you sacrifice, the more beautiful mansion you will have.
I guess I don't know what she was thinking. Yeah. I mean, I was 13 when I got out, so I never got really super indoctrinated, because by the time I was old enough to get into that place where I might be, they might start indoctrinating. Yes. Because of where I was in the lineup of the children, the adults were so concerned about what was happening among the adults and who was being arrested and who was being tried and who was on trial and all of those things that were happening. FBI was raiding our house in the middle of the night. Mexican police were raiding our house if we lived in Mexico. So the adults were concerned about what was happening with the adults. All the children were neglected. And so I didn't get that brainwashing, because I was just in that lineup where I was invisible. Yeah. Here is how invisible I felt. Yeah. When I ran away from home at 13, I did not expect anyone would even miss me.
Oh, You weren't even worried about that.
I knew that if they found me as I was walking to, where I was headed, that
Right.
they would get me and bring me back. I knew that. But I didn't know that anybody would even think, oh, where's Anna? Where did she go? Where is she? Why isn't she here?
Right.
I just felt invisible.
So tell the story of how you got out. And so lucky, as you mentioned, at 13, you were just a year away from being another wife for someone.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
So at age 14 is when you would get married off generally, or when you became eligible to become another sister wife to some man with umpteen wives already.
Right.
But my father died in prison when I was 12.
Okay.
So that was 1981. Sometime in 1982, Dan Jordan convinced my mother that Mark, who was, leading the Houston faction of our church, if you can call it that, Dan convinced my mother that Mark was putting Ervil's children on a path to hell because he was letting us go to the movies and listen to modern music and taking us to the roller skating rink on Friday nights. So we were just becoming way too worldly. My mom decided that he was right and decided to take us all back to Denver, where Dan Jordan was in charge of that faction. And because my father had died, there was kind of this split of who was going to be in charge next. And Dan Jordan, for sure, was wanting people to follow him and, move to Denver and be part of his group there. I didn't want to go to Denver. I had a history with Dan Jordan that I did not want to repeat. And that whole story is in the book, and, why I didn't want to go back to Denver. And so I decided to call my sister, her husband was the one in charge in Houston. And I told Lillian, I said, I don't want to go back to Denver. And she told me to start walking. So I walked out of my house with just the clothes on my back and began walking. It's over 3 miles to where she lived. I didn't know how far it was. To me, it felt like I walked all day, but
Right.
I had walked a little over 3 miles. I was getting near her house. I was probably within a couple of miles for her house.
Okay.
And she found me and picked me up. And then I was hidden in a hotel for 3 days. My mom did look for me the first night that I was gone. So she did notice that I was missing, which surprise.
Where's the other 50? Yeah.
Right. Now, so she looked for me that first night. And even though she could not find her 13-year-old daughter, my mother packed up all the other kids and moved back to Denver, leaving everything behind again. Like, that's how we always moved, was leaving everything behind. So it happened again. And I ended up just by the skin of my teeth, figuring out a way out, which I was so grateful for my sister and her husband who took me in and finished raising me.
Well, and so this sister, where did she fall? Was she a stepsister or one of the 5 that or 7 that she had with Gabriel?
No, she was one of the daughters of my father's first legal wife.
Okay.
And she was already grown because she was one of the she was one of the first ones born. So she was already grown and adult and had 5 children at that time.
Okay. And how were you able, you were able to call her on a landline from the house?
Right. Well, that's all we had back then.
They didn't have
the long phones, the little oval ones that sat on a shelf in the hallway with a long cord so you could take it into a room and have a private conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
I took it into the little hall bathroom and called her, and she said to start walking. So,
and were you like terrified that one of
course I was terrified.
Or somebody would hear you calling her on the phone?
Yeah, I was in the bathroom calling really secretly, like, I don't want to go back to Denver,
Yeah.
Trying not to be found out. And so,
because
if I had
your stepsister was actually given in marriage to Dan Jordan, correct? At 14, wasn't she 14?
Well, my both of my half sisters that were my mother's children from her previous relationship, were both married to Dan Jordan
at the same time.
No, well, both of them were married. One of them was first, and then at another later date, a stepsister and my half sister were married to Dan Jordan on the same day. at the same time, and they had to flip a coin to see who was going to spend the night with him first.
And
that's how sacred this act was.
Yeah. But again, an example that was set by Joseph Smith, 14-year-old girls, John Taylor, Lorenzo Snow, 14, 15-year-old girls. This was set by previous prophets. So in their eyes, they are following the true doctrine that was given by the first prophets that, on the earth. So amazing. So you get away to your sister. Your mother doesn't look for you. She throws the other kids in the car and says, I got to go. I got to leave. Was there ever, like, when she finally got to Denver, did she call your sister and say, hey, is Anna there?
Well, I don't know exactly how all of that transpired and how my mom eventually knew that I was living with my half-sister Lillian. I don't know how all of that transpired, and Lillian never told me, but I'm sure there was communication eventually, because Mark and Dan were trying to work things out and there was communication. So I don't know how that filtered through to them, but my mom did come and try to convince me to move back to Denver. And that was a terrifying day in my life as well. And I just kept, saying, I don't want to go back to Denver. I want to stay here. I want to stay here. And I don't know how my little 13-year-old self figured out how to advocate for my own wants and needs and desires.
Yes.
I don't know how that actually happened, because that's not what we were taught.
No.
Growing up, you were taught to sacrifice everything, don't complain, do what you're told, just subjugated at every level that's possible. And so how I came up with this, and I guess it was just my age, at that 13-year-old age, you're getting a little bit of like that psychological differentiation where you want to kind of find your own self. And part of me was discovering that, I guess. Yeah. And having lived with Mark and Lillian for long enough and been exposed to a little bit of the outside world long enough.
Okay.
There was just something there. And I'm grateful to this day that little 13-year-old Anna had the gumption and a little bit of spit and vinegar in it. My sister Celia says spit and vinegar. She had some spit and vinegar in her.
And that is exactly what I'm talking about, is the strength of, it's a gift. It really is a gift. The people that are willing and strong enough to say, I'm sorry, that's not for me.
Right.
This is for me. I can't do this. And and in spite of what are their neighbors going to think? What are my siblings going to think? What are my aunts and uncles going to think? I know this is not good for me. I have to do this. And that's such innate strength. Yeah.
It took a long time.
So your sister, Lillian, put you in a Christian school.
Yes.
Because you were 13, and she was like, I do not need another pubescent teenager on my hands here. So,
well, no, she just thought, in the public schools, there was drug, sex, and rock and roll. Yeah. And she, I'm sure, didn't want to have a unwed, teenage, pregnant, young girl on her hands. So in her mind, the lesser of two evils, even though she still sort of was kind of believing in the original, the original religion, they weren't all the way out yet. They eventually did get all the way out.
So where were her 5 kids going to school?
They were in public school. But they were elementary age at that time.
Oh, so kindergarten, first grade.
Yeah, she had 5 kids, but they, one of them was too small for school. Her 5th child, she was just days, weeks old when I went to live with Lillian.
Okay.
And so
her experience, the mother was with toddlers, basically.
Young children. I think their oldest son was probably 7, 8, or 9 at that point.
Okay. So she's thinking, okay, I've got a teenager. I don't know if I want to put her in middle school. Middle school is hell for everyone. Right?
So she enrolled me in a little Christian school that was just half a mile from her house. Okay. And I became a Christian there and accepted Jesus as my savior, as the language of that religion calls it, or Christianity calls it.
Right.
And when I went and enrolled there, it was the first time in my life I was able to make friends
Yes.
outside of the cult.
So you had
And
15-year-old girlfriends?
so that was the first time I was allowed to make friends.
Oh.
And, the teachers were told just enough about my family of origin story,
Right.
that they had a lot of compassion and empathy and just really took me under their wings. And it felt like such a safe haven for me among, all of the such
Chaos.
utter chaos and lack of security and lack of safety that I had grown up with.
Right.
So I was feeling like overwhelmed with, this is the best thing ever.
Yeah.
Like, all of these people are kind and good. And so when I went off to camp with the youth group and they said, do you want to invite Jesus into your heart? I was like, whatever you're selling, I'm buying. I didn't say it that way, but it was like, whatever this is, it feels so good.
Right.
To be embraced and to be loved and cared for, that I was saying, yes, absolutely, yes. Now, I did not understand anything about religions, Christianity versus Mormonism. I didn't know a thing, but all I knew was whatever they had that was so overwhelmingly different than what I had experienced the first 13 years of my life.
Yeah.
I was all in.
So what about education? When you get to this school, did your reading was up to par? Everything was, you didn't struggle in any area because your other, there had been zero. So did you struggle in those areas?
I was an avid reader. My sister taught me to read before I entered kindergarten. So I was an avid reader all my life, and that saved me for sure. But I struggled hard in math because we had been bounced around from school to school so often. You never got any complete year of instruction on any subject whatsoever.
Right.
And so math was a struggle. And with the arrangement that this school had and the curriculum they used, they tested me. They found all the gaps in my learning. And I was able to do what they called gap paces, and filled in all the gaps before they got me on track to graduate. And I graduated at 18 and a half with a real education.
That's amazing.
However, it wasn't an accredited school. So
that's the part I find so interesting. You graduate with this fabulous, kind, wonderful people, but it's not accredited.
It's not an accredited school. Later, I decided to go to college, or I was thinking about it at least, and they made me go get a GED to prove that I had an education because my diploma wasn't from an accredited high school.
Interesting. That's so interesting. So you get your GED and you head off to school. How did you pay for college?
Well, I didn't go to school at that time. I just got the GED because I was thinking about it.
Okay.
I didn't go to school, and now I've just completed a master's degree, but I didn't go to school for many, many years later.
Because you got married fairly young.
Yes.
Too.
And I met a little boy in that little Christian school, and we dated, if you want to call it that. I don't think it was called that. 7 years, and then got married when I was 21.
Yeah.
And so,
you started your family.
Yep. Had 5 kids and
5 children.
Raised them.
Yeah. And was your husband the sole provider while you were raising these 5 children?
For part of the time. And then I got a really great job, and we kind of swapped roles. And so he became kind of a stay-at-home dad, but then he went to school himself, and I put him through culinary school, and he his little career took off. So anyway, we kind of had to make it work because neither one of us had a degrees when we got married.
Yeah. So after your children, you waited until you were an empty nester, and then you went back to school.
Yes.
And so how did you finance? And you had to start out from the very beginning, associates, bachelors.
Well,
do that.
interestingly enough, the master's degree program that I entered into accepted my life's body of work in lieu of a bachelor's degree.
That's fabulous.
And I had to go through lots of, I had to fill out lots of paperwork, write lots of papers, and get lots of letters of recommendation. But I was able to bypass the bachelor's degree, which is currently a problem because I'm starting a doctoral program in like 2 weeks, I think it starts.
Yeah.
And because I don't have a bachelor's, I do not qualify for student loans.
Oh my!
Because you have to have a bachelor's to qualify for grad school loans. So I will be working and paying as I go. And I want to teach when I'm done. So I need to also not have student loans because teachers don't make a lot of money. So you can tell I'm not in this for the money.
Yes.
I'm going to pay as I go and work and make it and figure out how to make it work.
Right.
I sold my house actually to pay for the master's program.
That's amazing.
And to give me a little bit of, buffer so that I wouldn't have to work full time while I was in school.
Right. You know what's so beautiful about that? Because there's so much, because we're in a political season right now, there's a lot of talk about the Constitution, the founding fathers. So I've been doing a lot of YouTubing on the founding fathers. And I was listening this morning to Van Buren's story, and I've listened to John Adams' story, and I've listened to even Lincoln's story. And your story is their story. Absent parents, left by themselves, but loved to read, taught themselves, read everything they needed to do. And then they were put into apprentice programs. Through the apprentice programs, they became lawyers, they became attorneys. Then they worked. This is the way America was built. And then this obsession with college came in the 80s and 90s. And people are now $200,000 in debt for, because somehow to be a manager of the Gap, you had to have a bachelor's degree. I mean, it just completely, but I see people like you that have done it the old fashioned way through experience, trial, apprenticeship, learning on the job. That's the way it used to be. And that's where you get these people that know what they're doing. And I love that. I love that. And so
I consider myself to be very, very lucky. Now, I will say that there are several other of my siblings who have gone about it the entire old-fashioned way and worked their way through, community college and then go on to the, 4-year degree. And then some of them have master's degrees in really, really smart things. And one of my half brothers, he has a doctorate in electrical engineering. I mean, just
that's amazing.
So I consider myself to be very lucky that the program that was a great fit for me and for what I want to do when I finished my doctorate, was willing to accept all of the work that I'd done, my career, all the training that I did in my career, which I had a very good 17-year career that translated well into what I'm doing and all the volunteer work I've done.
Yeah.
Also.
That's amazing. And I think what I really want to highlight as well is the fact that your siblings, when you watch the documentary, people go and watch the documentary and get her book so that you can read the trauma and the chaos that this family went through. And yet, as you say, most of your siblings are mentally healthy, they're successful. And what I find absolutely mind-blowing is that you still have a love of God and a belief in Jesus Christ, in spite of this indoctrination and the blind obedience that was given to you, that you would follow this is what God said you should do. You're able to throw that out and still accept a belief. I find that absolutely beautiful.
Well, it's been a long journey for me of healing. So, we do have mental health issues in our family. Not everyone came out unscathed. Let me just put it that way, just to protect people's privacy, and that's their story to tell.
Right.
So there is some of that, and of course you would expect it under those circumstances.
Right.
So so I want to be very forthright about this situation.
That's good.
And also, I have my own mental health struggles, if you want to call them that.
Yeah.
I've been in therapy, in professional therapy, for over a decade. 5 years with one therapist during 1995 to 2000, a total of 5 years with another therapist between these years and these years. And then I currently started working with a new therapist here in the state that I live in now, in Washington State.
Yeah.
And so the struggle and the leaning in, pressing in for healing, for the not just PTSD that I was diagnosed with,
Right.
but not just PTSD, but complex PTSD.
Oh, absolutely.
And so the amount of work that I have done to heal, not just emotionally, but mentally and physically. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that
Yes.
talks about trauma and what it does and how it embeds itself into your body. And even though mentally you can be free and you can go on with your life and accomplish things, and I did. I got married, had kids, had a career, the whole thing, all the while struggling with the impact of the traumatic ways that we were raised.
Right.
Childhood developmental trauma is an absolute horror to try to recover from.
Interesting.
There is a test that you can take online. It's called the ACE score. ACE is, so it's Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it was a study done by a hospital system, because how adverse childhood experiences affects your health in later life. They found some direct correlations between, if you had experienced A, B, C, D, there's 10 questions that you ask somebody between the ages of birth to 18, have you experienced, and then there's 10 things that they ask. And I scored an 8 out of 10.
I can't believe you didn't do a 10 out of 10.
Well, the reason it wasn't 10 out of 10 is because nobody was drinking or doing drugs in the cult. But that's basically the only one, that depending on how you answer one of the questions, I maybe scored a 9 out of the 10. But drinking and drugs weren't a part of the issue that we had. But that was the only one that we didn't have as part of the cult.
That's amazing.
And so the amount of recovery that I have done, and I'm still doing, so still working with a professional therapist to undo the harm and the damage that was caused in that incredibly dysfunctional. I was talking to my brother Hiram just yesterday about it. I said, I just really want to encapsulate in words in how incredibly difficult that life was, that we experienced. And, we were talking, and there was a certain cuss word that we were using and how messed up it was. And I'll let you kind of figure out which word we were using. And there were a lot of yous that we used to say just how bad it was. So messed up.
Yeah.
And I'll be gentle with your audience and not say the words, but it was so messed up. So we are currently planning a time that we can sit down and really try to encapsulate with actual words, not just swears, how messed up it was.
Yeah. I don't know. I will be interested. Do a follow-up with you, because I don't know if you can verbalize.
I mean,
insane and abusive. It really was.
It was so toxic, and every kind of neglect you can imagine. There was abandonment involved, every kind of abuse you can think of, and probably some you haven't thought of yet.
Oh my gosh.
That involved in this whole life of, again, words are just, it's too much.
I love that you're saying that, because how do you prevent what you went through from, and how do your siblings prevent what you went through becoming generational trauma?
Right.
What have you been able to do to prevent your children from from somehow experiencing something because of the trauma that you went through and having this something carry on?
Well, I made a decision early on that I wanted my children to experience a different life than the one I had. And because of the capacity that I had to carry on with my life, and again, not everybody that goes through traumatic events has that innate capacity. I somehow did. And I was able to create a life for my children that was different than the one that I grew up with. And so that's one of the things that I am most proud of. You know, the book, the documentary, blah, blah, blah. The most thing that I'm most proud of is all 5 of my children lived in the same house for like 16 years that I owned that house. They all 5 graduated from the same high school, accredited high school.
Yeah.
You know, and they have opportunities in their life that I absolutely didn't have. I wasn't a perfect parent because, you know, really nobody is.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that as my children grew up and became adults, you know, I said to them, if you decide to go to therapy, one, I'll pay for it, because, you know, that's so important to me. Is if you feel like you need therapy, just let's go. Let's not let money be the thing that keeps you from that. But also own up to the damage or the harms that I might have caused to you in the parenting process, because I came very ill-equipped. Their father was very ill-equipped.
Yeah.
You know, that marriage didn't last. We ended up divorced.
Right.
And so, you know, they, you know, experienced some things in their life that, you know, were difficult.
Right.
And absolutely therapy can be helpful for anyone who's experienced difficulty.
Oh,
And
that's
so I said I would own up to the parts where I went wrong and things kind of went sideways. And anytime my children come to me and talk about the difficulties that I caused them, I do my best to make repair. And that's the key to, you know, parenting young adults, is being willing to hear, to really hear. You know, I could say to my kids, oh, you didn't suffer nearly as much as I did. Get over it.
Yes.
And that is absolutely the wrong way to deal with anything like that.
That is, I'm so glad you said that, because that is what you hear. Because at my age, I'm, you know, 20 years older than you. And at my age, my parents were the World War II people. And
I don't know. I'm a grandma and I'm 55.
Yeah, well,
you don't look 75 to me. So
I'm only 70, but my
Okay.
my mom is 92. And that is what I always heard. I got married at 16. I was taking care of kids. You don't even know what life was like. We never had that. I had to pick weeds and dandelions and wring the chicken's neck. And so everything was put down as, you don't know what hard is. And you know, and that's so, it diminishes your feelings. It diminishes your right to have feelings. And it just stops any kind of progression. So that's beautiful that you were, you know, able to recognize that. I'm sure the same thing. And we try to do better, but there's a lot of things that we learned. And so my anger, my temper, my spanking came from how I was raised. And, you know, we can laugh about it now. My kids laugh about it, you know, but I know that it wasn't, my kids are doing so much better than I was as a parent. The connection that they have with their children, open communication, it's so much better than what I did. And that makes me happy that they were able to, you know, progress even further. I did better, they're doing better. And I'm really interested in the therapy. I have a couple of girlfriends that have been doing therapy, and one of them that's just entering therapy. And I think what you're saying is so helpful, that we all have some kind of traumatic experience in our life. And as we mentioned before, we're not fighting, you know, we're not running in the trauma Olympics. So just because I wasn't raised in the LeBaron family doesn't mean a little therapy might not help a little bit, you know? How do you relate to because there is a lot of therapy, lexicon, verbiage going on. And one of the things I remember reading Roxane Gay's book, Bad Feminist. And one of the things she said is, I hate the trigger. She said, I hate the term trigger, because we all have to experience life, and we all can't walk around being afraid to say something that will trigger someone.
Mhm.
And she had a hard life. She had some bad experiences in her life. So for her to say that, I was like, oh, wow, that's an amazing thought process. Have you dealt with that in your therapy? The idea of being triggered or not
Oh,
being.
absolutely. I
Are
mean,
there-
they're being triggered is an absolute, like, you can use different terms, and maybe different therapy modalities will use different terms for those, that word. So maybe there's other words you can use,
Right.
but being able to self-regulate when you're triggered, that is an absolute skill that you can learn in therapy, where, like she was saying, you don't have to go around being afraid or whatever, saying the wrong thing, but there's also an element of compassion that people can have for somebody, especially if you know they've suffered,
Yes.
if they've experienced things, giving people trigger warnings, on content that people post online. Here's a trigger warning. There's, sexual abuse, or a trigger warning, child loss, or, trigger warnings are a kind thing to do for other people.
Beautiful.
And if somebody has suffered in a certain way, and it's going to be triggering for them to use certain language, it's kind to filter that in their presence. My
Right.
sister Celia, that you met in the documentary, she doesn't consider herself a religious person.
Oh.
I limit the amount of ways that I engage in conversation about my spirituality around her. And it's kind to do that. Like, especially knowing everything that happened to her. Of course, she's going to be triggered by language that's, that feels
religious,
and, that kind of the negative aspects of sometimes how people express their spirituality or, religiosity or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I'm careful about it around her out of kindness.
I love that.
And to me, the world needs more kindness.
Yes. I love that. It's not a matter of being right, being wrong, choosing this path. It's a matter of being kind. So I choose not to fight over this one issue because I feel like it's important to me, because out of kindness and love, I will respect where you're at.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a time and a place for having difficult conversations with people.
Yeah.
But giving them the space to choose and having their consent to engage in this kind of dialogue or the things, to me, those are the important ways to engage with people especially people who have experienced trauma of any kind. Somebody who's lost a child, having conversations about things surrounding that. You absolutely should be kind and filter what you say and use compassion in deciding how you have these conversations.
That's so interesting that you would say that. By the way, have you done a TED Talk?
No, I have not.
You should do a TED Talk. I mean, what you just said right there is your TED Talk. It's amazing. But I remember when our son passed away, the people who immediately gave us their religious perspective on his passing. Oh, think of him as being in the arms of Jesus, or think of how you'll see him again, or think of how much better he's now than he's not in the body he was in. And those are not my beliefs.
No.
So that was not comforting for me. And they just assumed that I would feel the same way. And so I end up being the person comforting them, trying not to hurt their feelings, and go, oh, thank you for that. Instead of saying, well, I don't believe that's true, but good for you.
Right.
So being aware of where they're at in their life, so that your expression can be kind.
Yes.
That is fabulous.
And what you were just describing, there's a term for that, and it's called spiritual bypassing, where you are using spiritual terms and spiritual language, and sometimes even spiritual cliche.
Yes.
And the intent behind it is good. They are trying to be comforting, but they're not self-aware enough to realize that there is a term for that, and it's called spiritual bypassing, because they're attempting to comfort themselves by trying to bypass your pain and help you feel better because they are uncomfortable. And that's a normal thing to experience. When a friend loses somebody, you know, what do you say to them? And sometimes it's just better not to say anything than the wrong thing. But those of us who've experienced pain and have had people come at us with spiritual cliche and spiritual bypassing, you know, it's also just, you know, that the intent behind it is good or kind. They just don't know better. But I'm saying, once you know better, do better. Like Maya Angelou says, once you know better, do better. And now that you've heard this, whoever your audience is, when people are in pain, spiritual bypassing is not a good solution.
That's beautiful. And you mentioned too, the process of recovery, a lot of it involves anger, and that's a natural step in the process. And I know I've heard this 5 steps of grief, anger. And so where was your anger phase? Was it at 13, or was it, at what point did you just realize, I am so darn mad at what I went through?
Ooh,
are we still in that phase now?
I mean, I was having that conversation yesterday with Hiram, because in my journaling, because of the therapy, you know, that I'm doing, I have a journal that I keep. It's just a notebook, but I call it my journal. And there was a lot of rage about the way that we were treated at a certain point in our life. I just lacked words. I was so enraged. You know, when they say our brain, you know, you have your prefrontal cortex, and that's where your thinking brain is, where you make decisions and plan, and you can think straight and have logic and reasoning. You know, when you're triggered, let's use that word. When you're triggered, this brain goes offline and everything goes back to the amygdala, where you can't reason with somebody who's been triggered. They're in their fight or flight response, which is in the back part of the lower part of the brain. And that's your fight and flight response. When somebody is what they call flip their lid, that's a little psychological term. If somebody's flipped their lid and they're triggered, then you can't reason with them. Have you ever tried to tell somebody who's flipped their lid to calm down? How effective is that? It's really not, you know. So
threw gasoline on the fire.
So as I'm journaling, I am so enraged that my thinking brain was just completely offline. I was back here in the fight or flight, so enraged. I was ready to like throw fists, you know, hold my earrings, let's throw down. And, you know, like, now I wasn't doing any of those things. I was putting all of that energy, it's externalizing that energy is what it's therapeutically known as, when you either speak it to somebody or you write it in your journal.
That's beautiful.
So I was externalizing all this rage that over the injustices that we experienced as a 9-year-old girl, specifically this little era of my life. And I lost connection to my prefrontal cortex and couldn't find words to describe just how angry I was about it.
Wow.
I can't imagine. I'm all like activated right now, just telling you this.
Yeah.
And so this is going to be part of my therapy session now, being able to externalize by sharing this story with you. When I was 9, we were left in Mexico with strangers that were part of my dad's cult, strangers to us. Hiram and I were left with this couple, and we didn't know who they were. We were left there a long time. I was left in Mexico over a year, and we got bounced around in Mexico a lot. But for the period of time that I lived with this couple in Mexico, I was 9. I would get sent downstairs to help the lady that lived below us. And I would work all day for this woman, and she would pay this couple my wages. I was 9, working all day to help this lady, and they would use that money to buy food for the household. And then, not just that, they would bake these cakes, and I would take a plate, put with the cake on it, frosted, and go door to door in Mexico by myself as a 9-year-old blonde American girl,
Right.
going door to door selling cake slices.
Wow.
We would paint these rocks, and I would go door to door selling paperweights.
Yeah.
And the money did not come to me. I didn't get to save up that money.
Right.
I got none of it. And again, this is what I was journaling about yesterday, and so enraged that I was their little child slave, and neither one of them had a job, and I was working.
Yeah.
They had 3 kids, I think 2 or 3 kids, and I was working.
Right. Right.
That just,
Oh, I can't imagine. I can't. And when you look at 9-year-olds today, and you look at what a 9-year-old is supposed to be going through at that age, or what a 13-year-old girl is supposed to be, laying on her bed looking at Teen Beat magazine, wondering where she can go to, Forever 21 and get a t-shirt for $3.99. And, that's what 13-year-old girls should be worried about. You were worried about escaping a cult so that for your safety and for your virginity and your health and your freedom at 13. Most
So-
girls,
yeah. So now you understand why the need for additional therapy,
Right.
and why I'm still in this process of healing the effects of the traumatic childhood developmental trauma. You can just search that term, and we missed out on so many developmental milestones just because we didn't have the appropriate caregiving. That just basic caregiving
Right.
was just not even a thing.
And there's so many things that they know now about, by the age of 2, this is
Yes.
developed by the age of my husband, for example, is blind in one eye because if you don't get some kind of optic care, if you have poor vision, by the time they're 8, the brain will shut off and say, oh, I guess we don't need that eye. And so it's literally nothing wrong with the eye, but the brain has shut off. So he has no depth perception in that one eye because he didn't get glasses.
Yeah.
He didn't get glasses before the age of 8. I mean, there's so many silly little milestones that if they don't crawl by a certain age, if they're not doing this by a certain age, and then like you were saying, nutritionally, you're not getting the nutrition that you need for proper brain development. I mean, there's so many things that go into that childhood neglect.
There's just, it was just so much. It was too much, really.
It really
And
was.
so I consider myself to be really lucky that I came out with the capacity to want better, to want to make better choices for myself, for my children eventually, and eventually get to the point now where I'm at now, where I'm on the other side. And even though I'm on the other side of that healing process, the healing still continues. And I feel like in this day and age now, we should normalize saying I'm seeing a therapist.
Yes, I love that. I'm going to do that because I really have, that's the beauty of friendships and people like you, that you can confirm a thought that you have. It's like, you know what? I think I need therapy. And like you say, because especially nowadays, we don't have quilting bees. We don't all get together with our coffee clutches with our neighbor girlfriends and shoot the bull and complain and get it off our chests. And so there is a lot of pent up frustration that we don't have the skills, just like your editor that helped you with your book. I am not a professional therapist. I don't have a psychology degree. I need someone with professional knowledge that can help me just be a better person, be a happier person. I have a family, like you were saying, I have a family that I look at my mom and her siblings. There were 8 in that family, and there was a ton of neglect. And, where the kids were on their own. My mom, same thing. My mom was not kicked out, but moved into an apartment with her little sister. And the other kids were grown and gone. And she was sent to the neighbors to work for her, to clean her house and stuff all the time. And she's bitter, angry about that. And her whole family is angry about things that they experienced. And it's debilitating. And it's through generationally where that anger, instead of being able to express your frustration, you're just angry. And that's your emotion. And I don't want that to be my emotion.
Right. I don't want that to be my legacy.
Yeah.
And therefore the therapy and a place where I can safely really get to express that. And so that I'm not causing harm to the people around me with that anger. I get to express it in a healthy way, in a place that's safe. And so for any of your listeners who are thinking, well, maybe I should find a therapist, sometimes if you have insurance, you can call the insurance company and say, is mental health included? And then if they say yes, you can go online and find a therapist that, takes new patients. You can decide, male, female, in a lot of cases, if you have insurance. But if you don't have access to insurance, if you have access to a college or a university that has a counseling program, they often need their counselees and the ones in training. They need people to practice on.
Right.
And so they offer sometimes free or at very low cost, $10, $15 a session or whatever, where you can meet with somebody who's being trained to become a counselor. And what I tell people is that the vast majority of the help and the good that comes out of therapy isn't what the therapist says to you, even though those things are helpful and that guidance is needed. The vast majority of the good that happens in therapy is what you are saying to the therapist.
That's amazing.
Being able to externalize your story. When it's internalized, let's just say, my 9-year-old self that was in Mexico selling cake slices door to door, and I have a lot of anger about that mistreatment. When it's internalized, it's my 9-year-old self who is experiencing those things and re-experiencing them. Once you externalize it in a journal or speaking it out to a therapist specifically and hopefully, you're like whatever age you are, I'm 55. So my 55-year-old self gets to see these things and process them in a new way, so that those things that happen to you at young ages can be processed in a way that gets to put them in the past instead of them continuing to affect your day-to-day life today. So if you don't have access to any kind of therapy, I would suggest sitting down with a safe person. There's a book called Safe People. If you want to know, okay, how do you know who's a safe person? Yeah. There's a book called Safe People, and you can read that book and take from it what you will and make decisions from that. But even just sitting down with a really good friend who is a safe person and saying, I've never told anyone this.
I'm going to
externalizing it in that way.
In the link, because that's beautiful, because that's the scary part for a lot of people, that they don't feel as though they have a safe person.
Right. And we're taught to mask those things. Right. And to, I've had so many people, when I share my story publicly, come up to me afterwards and say, and whisper things in my ear. I've never told anyone this, but and they fill in the gaps. And then it's because they recognize, like, oh, somebody in this world is going to understand the level of pain that I've been through.
Right.
And so I always just get to whisper back in their ear, the healing process has begun just with you saying this out loud.
Yes.
That's so brave of you to say it out loud. And now would you consider going to see a therapist? Like we need to normalize talking about the therapeutic value of going to see a counselor or talking to people, talking to our girlfriends. And in addition, normalize talking about sometimes needing medication.
Okay.
To help you with your mental health or mental stability.
That's perfect.
There's no shame in taking a medicine for your heart problem. Yeah. Or for diabetes or whatever condition you have that's going on with your body.
Right.
Like, no, I got to go take my pill for whatever it is. Nobody is shaming anyone for seeking medical help and taking pills for whatever medical thing is going on.
Right.
Let's normalize not shaming people for needing help with whatever's going on with them.
That's beautiful.
You know, anxiety, depression, all of these things, sometimes the medication can help.
Right. And I love that. And with that message, I want you to tell everybody, where can they get your book? I'll put up, before we close, I'll put up another picture. The Polygamist Daughter.
Mhm.
And then Watching the Cult on the
Daughters of the Cult.
Daughters of the Cult on Hulu or Disney Plus.
Yeah. So the book is available anywhere books are sold.
Okay.
It's even online, on Amazon, used sometimes, if you're lucky. Even public libraries, if they don't have it on the shelf, they can bring it in for you. It's on Audible. So if you enjoy Audible books, I read the Audible edition, and it's part of the Audible Plus library. So you don't even have to spend a credit to listen.
Oh my God.
So there's free ways to do it. And then if you just want to buy it and own a copy, then that helps me, and I appreciate that. But also for people who don't have that kind of discretionary funds, it's available in a lot of different ways for free.
That's absolutely beautiful. And I love that you narrated your Audible version, because those are my favorite Audible books, is when the author, because their personality comes out in the words and they put the emphasis where it should be.
Yes.
I love that. So I'm
a little fun fact about that. I had to audition to read my own book.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Who decided who was hired?
Well, I mean, the company that bought the rights to the Audible edition, or was a company called Blackstone Media, I think it's called. And, they hired a company to audition me. So I had to make sure that my voice and how I read, and that I can read, I guess,
Oh, that's good. But that's true. I mean, there have been a couple of audiobooks that I've gotten that I was like, I can't listen to this.
Yeah.
Your voice.
And it's part of, there are preferences also involved in that. So I get reviews on Audible, both positive and negative, like, oh, I'm so glad it was her that read the book. And then other people going, oh my gosh, no, why is she reading her own book? People shouldn't read their own books. So I get positive and negative reviews on Amazon. I've just learned to take it with a grain of salt, and I've grown a real thick skin about it. And so it's all good.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Anna. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on the show. And I think your message, it's going to fall on people in many different ways. And hopefully it will be helpful for wherever people are in their journey. But I love, if you don't get anything else from the message, I love the fact that if you just say it out loud, that's the first step of healing. Yeah. And I hope that message gets out to the people, whatever your life circumstances are or have been. Yes. That to take away your strength, and then take away your courage, and also to get help, to seek help. And just by saying, I need help, is the first step.
And I will say, I am living, breathing, walking around proof that regardless of your family of origin story, regardless of the things that have happened to you, the injustices you've experienced, it is possible to heal and to create a life for yourself that is good, that is life-giving, and that you can be proud of.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, you have a great week, and good luck with your doctoral program. I'm so impressed. You've just motivated me to get off my tail and do something, because I just decided, I've struggled going to school because same thing, raising children. And now that I'm a complete empty nester, my only trouble is now I'm just retired and lazy. And I'm like, I don't know, do I want to go someplace at 9:00? Maybe,
Listen, like, I look forward to that, but that's not the season I'm in right now. And I'm happy in the season I'm in.
Yeah.
So, I have a lot of gratitude, and that's the important part.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Is she not the best? And her message, I cannot think of any other message that I've ever heard. It was actually, it just encompassed so many areas of all of our lives. We've all gone through a different kind of a journey, but I'm sure we've all had peaks and valleys throughout our life. And everything that she said is going to hit us someplace in our journey. And it was absolutely beautiful. So I want to remind you again, I'm going to put up a picture of her book so that you can recognize it when you see it. So let me throw this up there, and let me take me off for just a second. The Polygamist Daughter is her book. So really, this is what I like to do. I like to get the Audible version, but then I always end up getting a hard copy because there's always going to be something that I want to highlight, that I want to copy, paste, and share. And so I end up getting both, but I love the audio version so that I can walk or take a hike or be cleaning the house or whatever, and I can still get my books in. So I'm definitely going to be downloading that today, and I hope you do as well. So have a great week. I hope you enjoyed Anna's story. Also, watch the documentary on Hulu. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think what's fascinating about it is that this all happened in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't that long ago. That's when I was having my children. My children were all born in the 70s and 80s. So it wasn't that long ago. And to see how successful these people are in their journeys from the neglect that they went through is absolutely inspiring. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I will see you again next week on She Became Visible. Bye-bye.